So let's remember Father Michael Mueller in the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, page 131. He delivered his body and blood to his apostles, whom he then appointed the priests of the New Testament. And to them and to their successors in the priesthood he gave a command to offer by these words, "Do this for commemoration of me," Luke 22:19. So the Catholic Church has always understood and taught, end quote. That is a lie. That is a documentable, recognized lie. It's a lie of piety, but it's untrue. But that's what's been taught within one realm of Roman Catholic piety and belief. I have a feeling that Rule would accept that with maybe some caveats, because he wouldn't want to have to defend that because he knows he can't. But there's the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. Richard Hanson, The Christian Priesthood Examined, Lutterworth Press, 1979, page 31. Does the New Testament recognize any individual minister as a Christian priest in virtue of his being a minister? The reader will not be surprised to find that this question must receive as an answer an emphatic negative. Next page. There is no mention of Christian priests. There is no mention of Christian officials as priests in the New Testament, whatever. We have no ground for assuming that the large number of priests of the Jewish temple who, we are told, became Christians, officiated as or were regarded as priests in a specifically Christian sense. Despairing attempts have been made to read the existence of Christian priests into various parts of the New Testament. There is no other part of the New Testament where a mention of Christian official priests is even remotely likely. But of official Christian priests, we must honestly admit there is in the New Testament not the faintest whisper. Not the faintest whisper. Later on he says, no Christian priesthood is found in the New Testament. There is, in fact, no solid evidence that anyone thinks of Christian ministers as priests until about the year 200. Attempts have been made to find evidence for a Christian priesthood in the 2nd century. If some passages can plausibly be dressed up to appear like evidence for a Christian priesthood in the 2nd century, then it might be possible to interpret passages in the New Testament which are not apparently favorable to this interpretation as in reality favoring it, and so the blessed haven of an apostolic or dominical institution for the priesthood might be reached. Likely candidates for the position of priests in the 2nd century should be presbyters or bishops, but nobody called these priests at that time, page 36. Also on page 36, after discussing one appearance of priest in Ignatius, there can be no basis for a Christian priesthood in the 2nd century here. After discussing Clement, those of you following the church history series that I'm teaching right now, we've just done Clement and Ignatius, did the martyrdom of Polycarp this past Sunday morning. After discussing Clement, he only knows of 2 ministers in the Christian church, that of episkopos, presbyter, bishop, and presbyter being regarded as identical, as in Acts 20:28, Hermas, the Didache, and the pastoral Paqua on this very issue. He admitted that, from their perspective, priest developed out of the term presbyter. The problem is presbyter, presbyteros, episkopos, bishop, they're interchangeable terms in the New Testament. Not different offices. Nothing about sacraments, nothing about sacramental authority. The apostles of the New Testament had no concept of what has become the absolutely central and essential office of the sacramental Roman Catholic Church. Had no concept of it. This is why they cannot believe in sola scriptura, because if the scriptures are sufficient for the man of God, as they claim to be, then so many of her dogmas must be abandoned because they have no defensible basis in the New Testament whatsoever. You can't have the miracle of transubstantiation without an ordained sacramental priest. Eventual development of the Roman Catholic dogmatic teachings that are available today. Now this is really interesting. Again, this is still Hanson. The Christian Priesthood Examined. This is really, really interesting because this really resonates with me. It is appropriate at this point to pause and ask why the doctrine of a Christian priesthood, which is absent from the beginnings of the Christian ministry, should have emerged in the 3rd century. Perhaps it is significant. Listen to this. This is really interesting. I had forgotten that I had read this years and years ago. Probably because I read this long before I preached through all of Hebrews. Perhaps it is significant that the epistle to the Hebrews, after Tertullian, who refers to it only once or twice and tends to think that it was written by Barnabas, is totally unused in the Western Church until the middle of the 4th century. It does not seem to have been very influential in the Eastern Church during the 3rd century. Clement of Alexandria and Origen, in their references to it, make it clear that its Pauline authorship was not securely established. This must have tended to reduce its influence. Now think about that one for a moment. Think about what that means. What's the assumption going on here? The assumption, and it's a proper assumption, is if you read Hebrews, if you believe Hebrews, you're never going to believe Rome's teaching about her priests. Because the teaching of Hebrews is thoroughly, 100%, unalterably opposed to any concept of a sacramental priesthood in the church, some concept of a representation of the one sacrifice of the cross. Hebrews 7 through 10 is death to all of this. So isn't it fascinating that in asking, well, how did this arise? One of the answers given by this historian is, well, the period of time when it arises was a period where it doesn't seem like the book of Hebrews was exercising much in the way of influence. And I would add to this something that I've commented a number of times. You cannot even begin to understand what Hebrews is saying if you do not have a vital understanding of the Tanakh, a familiarity that goes beyond having gone to Sunday school and seen some flannel board presentations about the tabernacle. It needs to be the familiarity of a person who is intimately and regularly reading the text of the Tanakh, and especially of the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And so once you have the fatal and final schism between synagogue and church, necessary, but the way that it ended up happening, inordinate, to where you have the development of anti-Semitism, and you then combine that with the rise of allegorical interpretation as the primary mechanism for dealing with the text of the Tanakh, and falling into ignorance in regards to Jewish tradition and Hebrew language, and hence the backgrounds of Hebrews and so on and so forth. You put all that together, and that leaves the room for the development of something that, in light of Hebrews' teaching, would never ever develop otherwise. Would not be allowed to develop otherwise. Because if you believe Hebrews is apostolic, then you cannot believe that the Roman priesthood is. Not a possibility. It's day and night, X, not X, law of non-contradiction, whole 9 yards. It is fully contradictory to the biblical teaching at this point.